As soon as I removed the painting, I saw a hidden safe, full of cash, forged deeds, and questionable photos of my husband with another woman. For a few minutes, I couldn't move, thinking maybe I was dreaming this. Let me take you back to where it all began. My name is Margaret Lawson. I'm 74 years old. In 1976, something happened that changed everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and myself. It didn't come like a storm. It came quietly, like a soft click behind a painting, a safe door swinging open, and a truth I could no longer ignore. But before I found the safe, before the lies unraveled, I lived on Magnolia Street in Savannah, Georgia. Back then, I was the wife of Richard Lawson, a man everyone in town seemed to admire. Banker. Deacon. Devoted father. The kind of man who shook hands at the farmer's market and got thanked from the pulpit on Sundays. People used to smile at me like I was lucky. And in some ways, I was. We had a grand white-columned house with a wraparound porch and hydrangeas that bloomed like blue thunderclouds. I had two beautiful children, Caroline and James, who gave my life meaning when the rest felt like performance. But even when things looked perfect, I always sensed something beneath it. I met Richard in the spring of 1959. He was confident, borderline cocky, but charming enough to make you forgive it. He talked like a man who'd already won the world and was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. I was young, recently hired as a literature teacher, and flattered that someone like him was interested in someone like me. We married fast. Too fast, maybe, but I told myself it was love, and maybe in some early way, it was. He gave me a life I couldn't have imagined growing up. Fancy dinner parties. Church galas. Vacations on the coast. And I played the part willingly. I ironed his shirts until the pleats could cut glass. I smiled when the cameras came out. I learned how to speak without saying too much. Still, I noticed things. The way he'd go silent for hours after receiving certain phone calls. The moments when he'd come home from work dinner smelling like someone else's perfume. The times he looked through me instead of at me. But I told myself this was marriage. That all men have secrets. That he was just tired. He never yelled. He never raised a hand. But control doesn't always come in loud forms. Sometimes it's the way he makes you feel silly for asking questions. The way he calls you emotional when you raise concerns. The way he says, "Trust me, Margaret," like trust is a leash you're lucky to wear. And for a long time I wore it. But everything changed that spring morning in 1976, when I adjusted a crooked painting in his study and found the safe behind it. Inside was the truth. Cash. Forged deeds, letters to another woman. And photos, intimate, unmistakable, of my husband with someone who wasn't me. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just stood there, frozen, thinking maybe I'd fallen asleep standing up and would wake up any second. But I didn't. And that's when I realized, the life I'd built was never mine to begin with. After I found the safe, something shifted in me, quietly, like the way fog slips in under a door. I kept going through the motions, but inside, everything was rearranged. It was like I was watching my life from across the room, waiting for a stranger to speak my lines. And suddenly, I started seeing Richard the way I should have seen him years ago. He was always a man who knew how to fill a room. The way he shook hands, the way he told stories like they were parables meant just for you. People didn't just like him, they trusted him. And trust, I've come to learn, is the easiest mask for a liar to wear. At the bank, he handled retirements, pensions, estate transitions. He made people feel safe, like he had their best interests in mind. Widows, veterans, church members, he guided them through their most vulnerable financial moments with a smile and a Bible verse. At church, he stood at the pulpit on Sundays and read scripture with a voice like warm thunder. When he prayed, people bowed their heads a little lower. When he spoke, people said things like that man was sent by God. And I used to believe that too. Back in the early days, I thought I was the lucky one. He had ambition, and that ambition built us a beautiful life. He made people feel important. He made me feel chosen. He never said no when I wanted something, a new dress, a trip to Charleston, a bigger dining table for the Christmas party. But he also never said yes to the things that really mattered to me. When I said I missed teaching, he told me, "You don't need to work. You're already doing God's work at home." When I wanted to visit my sister in Atlanta for a few days, he said, "Why go away when everything you need is right here?" And when I once asked him if he ever felt lonely, he laughed and said, "What on earth do you mean? You've got me." It didn't feel cruel at the time. Just final, like a door gently closing behind me. Looking back now, I wonder how much of his kindness was just control in a prettier coat. He kept meticulous records of everything, our spending, our social engagements, even the donations we made. Not because he was generous, but because it bought him power. Influence. He liked being the man everyone owed a favor to. And he had rules, most of them unspoken: never ask him twice about something he doesn't want to answer. Never contradict him in front of guests. Never suggest he's not doing enough, at the bank, at the church, or at home. He was never violent. Never raised his voice. But that made it harder to explain the tension in the house, the kind that builds in the pauses between sentences, in the way a door closes just a little too hard when you walk away. People always said, "Richard's such a good man." And I said it too. Over and over. Until I didn't know if I was lying or surviving. I remember once, in the middle of the night, I found him sitting alone in his study with the lights off. Just staring at the fireplace. When I asked if everything was okay, he said, "Go back to bed, Margaret. You don't need to worry about anything. That's my job." And I did go back to bed. But I didn't sleep. That night stayed with me. Like a loose thread in a beautiful dress, something you can ignore for a while, until one day the whole thing comes apart in your hands. I used to think Richard was a complicated man with a good heart. Now I think he was just good at pretending. If you'd asked anyone in Savannah back then, they would have told you we had the perfect life. The Lawsons were admired. Richard was on every board that mattered. I was invited to every charity event that had crystal wine glasses and live piano music. Our children were well-dressed, well-behaved, and photographed often. There were photos of us in the local paper, ribbon cuttings, donation drives, Sunday luncheons. In every one, I'm smiling, standing beside Richard like we were sculpted out of Southern tradition. The house, the children, the pearls, the smile. A portrait of success. And for a while, I leaned into it. Because it was easier to believe the illusion when everyone else seemed so invested in it. But even in our curated little world, I started noticing gaps. A bank client stopped me at the market one afternoon, a widow I'd met once at a church fundraiser. She thanked me for a donation we'd supposedly made to her late husband's veteran group. I smiled, nodded, said how glad I was Richard could help. But I didn't remember writing that check. Later that week, I checked our records. No such donation. I told myself it must have gone through some committee at the bank. Still, the moment stuck with me like a loose thread behind the wallpaper. Then came the envelopes, business envelopes, sealed tight, delivered late at night. Richard started locking the study more often. I'd hear the safe click shut just as I came down for tea. When I asked about it, he smiled and kissed my forehead and said, "Just boring paperwork, sweetheart." The first time I saw the name Claire Bishop was on a sign-up sheet at church. She had volunteered for the meal program, the same one I helped coordinate. A young widow, newly arrived in Savannah, quiet but pleasant. Her handwriting was perfect, clean loops and careful curves. Richard mentioned her in passing after one service. Said she'd approached him about grief counseling and financial advice. He said it like it was a burden, like it annoyed him. But something in his eyes didn't match his tone. 2 weeks later, she started appearing everywhere. She was polite, always helpful, always just a step behind me at events. Carrying dishes, arranging flowers, folding napkins. The older women adored her, called her sweet, said she was trying her best to get back on her feet. She laughed softly, listened well, and never outshone anyone. She was good at blending in, too good. I told myself I was imagining things. That grief makes people cling to community. That Richard was just being kind, like he always was. But then I found her scarf in the passenger seat of his car. Silk. Pale blue. Still smelled faintly of lavender and rose. When I asked about it, Richard didn't flinch. He said Claire must have dropped it during one of the church errands. He'd been giving rides to several people, helping out where he could. Don't read too much into it, Margaret, he said with that same easy voice he used when smoothing over overdraft fees at the bank. And I laughed. I laughed and said of course. Because that's what a perfect wife does, she believes her perfect husband. Even when her stomach feels like it's full of needles. But I started watching after that. Noticing when he came home later than usual. Noticing when Claire happened to be volunteering on the same days Richard was working late at the church. Noticing the way he looked at her, not openly, not obviously, but in a way that felt practiced. Measured. There's a certain kind of silence that grows between two people, not the kind that comes from comfort, but the kind that hides 100 unsaid things. Our house became full of that kind of silence. Even the children noticed. Caroline asked one night why Daddy wasn't saying grace at dinner anymore. James, just 9, started sleeping with the hallway light on. I told them everything was fine. That grown-ups just get busy. That Daddy loved them very much. And then I tucked them into bed with stories I could barely get through myself. I remember thinking, if this is what marriage is supposed to look like, maybe I was never built for it. Maybe I was too curious, too aware, too unwilling to look the other way. Or maybe I just wasn't meant to be invisible. That night, I sat on our bedroom floor with a bottle of wine and a box of old photographs. I looked at pictures of the two of us, our wedding, our first house, our children's first birthdays. I tried to remember if the man in those photos had ever really belonged to me, or if I'd just been the first stop on a road he always planned to keep driving down. I didn't cry, not then. Crying would have meant I was ready to admit something had ended. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead, I started doing what Richard always accused me of doing too much, I thought. I watched. I began taking mental notes, times, names, places. What events Claire attended. When Richard left the house. I didn't write anything down at first. Just kept it in my head, like a running tally of things that didn't add up. One Thursday, Richard came home late and left his jacket on the back of a chair. I found a matchbook in the pocket from a restaurant in Charleston, one he said he hadn't been to in over a year. Claire had mentioned in passing that she'd lived in Charleston before Savannah. Coincidence? Maybe. But I didn't believe in coincidence anymore. Not between people who smiled like nothing had happened and laughed like everything already had. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse. I didn't scream or throw things like women do in the movies. Because that's not how women like me are allowed to break. Instead, I cleaned the kitchen. I ironed his shirts. I picked up the dry cleaning. And when he kissed me on the forehead and said, "Long day, don't wait up," I smiled and said, "Of course." Because I wasn't ready to fight him. I was preparing to outsmart him. And to do that, I had to be the same Margaret he thought I'd always been. The perfect wife. The harmless shadow behind his perfect life. The safe was small, no bigger than a suitcase, and tucked neatly into the wall behind the painting. If that frame hadn't shifted just slightly, if I hadn't straightened it out of habit, I might never have found it. The irony still stings. It wasn't even locked. Not really. Just a simple turn dial. Left 24. Right 6. Left 18. I didn't know the numbers by heart, but my fingers did. I'd seen Richard open a similar lock 100 times. His hand moved without thought, muscle memory shaped by trust. Mine did too, shaped by doubt. When the door swung open, the air inside was dry and stale. Paper and metal and a faint smell of cologne. And inside, neatly stacked in rows, were the things I hadn't wanted to find. Bundles of cash, bound tight in thick rubber bands, labeled in handwriting that was not his bank's. A collection of property deeds, some with names I recognized from church, others that meant nothing to me, but the signatures were forged. I could tell even with an untrained eye. The ink was wrong. The dates didn't match. And then there were the letters. Dozens of them, bundled with a silk ribbon, not like a criminal hiding his tracks, but like a lover preserving his legacy. They were addressed to Claire. Page after page, his words told the story I had only suspected until now. Once things are finalized, we'll be free. I promise you a life Margaret could never understand. It's close now. She's weaker than she looks. She suspects nothing. I see us waking up by the ocean, you, in that pale blue dress I love. Me, unburdened. Unburdened. That word hung in the back of my throat like acid. There was no mention of our children. No guilt. Just plans. Financial transfers, trust arrangements, insurance policies. Like I wasn't a person, just a complication. Something to be cleared away. He even detailed how the accounts were routed. Offshore. Layered through dummy charities. Names I'd heard at dinners. Organizations I'd fundraised for. Faces I'd smiled at while handing out hors d'oeuvres. They were all part of it. And Claire? She wasn't just a passing affair. He promised her everything, not just money, but identity. He wrote about their future name, the house they would buy, the lie they would tell, that she was a widow, and he a grieving man finally learning to love again. Then came the photographs. They weren't explicit. But they were intimate. Him and Claire walking barefoot along a beach I didn't recognize. His hand on her lower back. Her lips on his cheek. Both of them smiling like they had already buried the past. And the worst part? He looked happy. Happier than I remembered him ever looking with me. I stood there for a long time, holding those pages and shaking hands. At some point, I sank to the carpet. The quiet tick of the mantel clock was the only sound in the room. My heartbeat felt like it belonged to someone else. This was real. This was mine. This was my life now. I wasn't angry yet. Anger takes shape later, once the wound has a name. At that moment, I felt hollow. Not broken, just emptied. Like everything I had built, protected, and believed in had evaporated in the space between a painting and a wall. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't run. Instead, I folded the letters back up. I tied the ribbon exactly as I found it. I placed the photographs back in their envelope. I closed the safe, spun the dial, and straightened the painting. Then I stood in front of it for a while. Listening. To the house. To the silence. To the woman I had been 5 minutes ago, now gone. And I thought to myself, now I know. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed beside Richard, staring at the ceiling while his breath rose and fell in steady, oblivious rhythm. Every time he shifted in his sleep, I flinched, afraid he could somehow hear my thoughts. He had always claimed to know me better than I knew myself. Maybe now, for the first time, I hoped he didn't. The next morning, I made his coffee, kissed his cheek, and smiled like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I had crossed an invisible line. There was no going back. And in the quiet space between folding laundry and buttering toast, I began constructing a new life, not one I wanted, but one I might need to survive. I couldn't tell anyone. Not Caroline, not James. Not even my sister, who lived a few hours north. If Richard caught wind that I was suspicious, he'd get ahead of me. I'd seen how quickly he could move when threatened, the way he handled disloyal clients, the way people who crossed him suddenly disappeared from the social scene like they'd never existed. I'd lived in his world long enough to know, Richard didn't get mad. He removed obstacles. So I became quiet. Purposeful. Invisible. I began copying things. Not the whole safe, that would be too obvious, but enough. A few letters. The most incriminating deed. A photo. I tucked them inside a hollowed-out cookbook in the kitchen, Savannah's Southern Secrets, a title that suddenly felt appropriate. I also started setting aside cash. Small bills at first, 10s, 20s, 50s, slipped out of Richard's desk drawer, his coat pockets, his car. He wouldn't miss it. Men like Richard never notice small change. They only look at totals. I buried the money in a mason jar beneath the rose bush out back. Each day felt like walking a tightrope in heels. He would come home, kiss me on the forehead, talk about work, ask about the kids, and I would answer, cook dinner, laugh at the right moments. All the while wondering, does he know I know? One night, I caught him staring at me while I was brushing my hair in the mirror. Not like a man watching his wife. Like a man watching a door. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "Just tired," I replied. "You're not sick, are you?" "No. Just tired." He nodded, smiled, and walked off. But I didn't miss the way he paused in the doorway, like he was waiting for me to slip. That's when I realized, he was watching me too. That knowledge made everything harder. Every step I took had to look natural. Every drawer I opened, every call I made, every note I scribbled, it all had to seem routine. I could no longer afford to be reactive. I had to be precise. And I needed help. But help meant risk. It meant telling someone. Trusting someone. There was only one person who came to mind. Samuel Trent. He was a federal investigator I had met once, maybe a year earlier, at a church luncheon. He'd been polite, quiet, and unlike most of Richard's friends, he hadn't flirted or flattered. He'd asked questions about the church's community outreach programs, then disappeared into the crowd like someone used to listening more than speaking. I remembered his eyes, not cold, but serious. Like someone who believed in rules. Not church rules. Real ones. So I wrote him a letter. Not too direct. Just enough to raise a flag without waving it. "Mr. Trent, we met once at Christ Trinity. I may have a matter of financial and ethical concern related to a member of our congregation. If you're ever in Savannah again, I'd appreciate a conversation, purely as a fellow believer in accountability. Warmly, Margaret Lawson." I mailed it from the next town over. Then I waited. For 3 days, nothing happened. And then on the 4th, a man claiming to be from Vanguard Life Insurance called the house and asked to schedule a meeting regarding a recent audit. Richard handed me the phone. Said it was probably something to do with my father's old policy. I played along, wrote down the date. Smiled. And when I hung up, I felt my hands shaking, not from fear. From the first flicker of hope I'd felt in weeks. Agent Samuel Trent arrived under the name Robert Kessler, wearing a pale gray suit and a southern drawl that fit in just enough to blend. He showed up at the house as scheduled, clipboard in hand, polite smile, nothing that would rattle suspicion. Richard barely looked up from his newspaper as I offered the agent sweet tea on the porch. "Appreciate your time, ma'am," he said, eyes meeting mine for a brief second too long. It was a confirmation, not a greeting. Richard didn't stay for the conversation. "I'll be at the club," he said, grabbing his keys without a second glance. When the door clicked shut, I finally exhaled. Samuel leaned in just slightly, just enough to say, "You did the right thing. But you're sitting on a live wire." We spoke in code, mostly. He explained they'd been watching Richard and a few other community figures for some time now. The financial web was bigger than expected: bank laundering, shell companies, retirement theft. Veterans. Widows. Church donations redirected into offshore pipelines. He asked what I had. I told him: documents, letters, a photo, names. I didn't offer everything. Not yet. He didn't press. "We'll move soon," he said. "But until we do, don't change your rhythm. Don't panic. Don't go looking for more." I nodded. "We suspect he's planning to disappear," Samuel added. "That's what they do once the cash is secured. Men like your husband don't leave loose ends, Mrs. Lawson. And right now, you're the biggest one." The words didn't shock me. I think a part of me already knew. Before he left, he handed me a business card, fake name, burner number, slipped it inside a church bulletin. To anyone else, it looked like a sermon summary. To me, it was a lifeline. As he pulled out of the driveway, Richard pulled in. Their cars passed each other like strangers. And I stood in the doorway, holding a piece of paper that could either save my life, or end it. I used to think fear came with screaming, running, locked doors and raised fists. But real fear, the kind that seeps into your bones, it's quieter than that. It looks like your husband handing you a cup of tea and watching too closely when you take the first sip. It was little things at first. I noticed a drawer in the study that had been rearranged. The cookbook where I'd hidden the copied documents was an inch off center one morning, not enough to notice, unless you were me. Richard had started asking more questions. What time are the kids' events again? Did you talk to anyone while I was gone? You seem off lately, is something wrong? I smiled. Always smiled. But I was watching him, too. One evening, I caught him standing outside the bedroom, just listening. Not moving. Just his shadow in the hallway light. I called out his name. He didn't answer right away, then said he was getting water, like it was the most normal thing in the world. But I didn't hear the kitchen sink run. That night, I locked the bedroom door for the first time in our marriage. Not because I thought he'd break it down, but because I wanted to know if he tried. He didn't. But the next morning, he noticed the lock. Said nothing, but I saw it in his eyes, a flicker of something sharp and wordless, a private calculation. Then came the pills. He brought me tea again, as he often did. But this time I tasted something off, just a faint bitterness. I didn't say anything. I let him watch me drink it, then slipped away to the bathroom and poured it down the sink. The fear wasn't loud, but it was constant. Was he testing me? Or had he already made a decision? Every sound in the house became a question mark. The creak of the floorboards. The click of the study door. The way he locked his car, even when it was parked in the driveway. I slept less. Ate less. I lost weight, which Richard noticed. You're shrinking on me, he said once, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind. Gotta keep you strong. His voice was soft. Gentle. Almost loving. But his hands were cold. And in the mirror, I didn't recognize myself anymore, not just because of the weight, but because of the woman looking back. She wasn't frightened. Not anymore. She was calculating. It happened just after dawn. The kind of soft, honey-lit morning Savannah is known for pink sky, warm air, birdsong over quiet streets. I had just put the kettle on when I saw them, 4 black sedans. No sirens. No dramatic screeching tires. Just doors opening in unison, men in dark windbreakers walking with silent purpose toward my front door. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I reached for the sugar jar, not because I needed it, but because I needed to do something that still made sense. By the time Richard came downstairs, they were already on the porch. He paused at the base of the stairs, still in his robe, his hair neatly combed like he was preparing for a meeting. For a second, just one, I thought he might pretend he didn't know why they were here, but he didn't ask. He looked at me instead. For the first time in years, he really looked at me. And I couldn't tell if he saw a wife or a threat. Mr. Lawson, the agent said. We have a warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, embezzlement, falsifying financial records, and obstruction of justice. The house filled with footsteps and voices. Papers rustled. Radios crackled. Caroline came running down the hallway in her pajamas, eyes wide. James stood frozen on the staircase. Mom? What's going on? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Richard was handcuffed in the living room, right under the portrait of our family from 10 years earlier. The same smile, the same suit. A man with nothing to hide. The agents didn't ask me much. One of them, Trent, gave me a subtle nod, no smile. Just a flicker of recognition. A silent assurance that this part was almost over. When they walked Richard out, the press was already waiting. Reporters, cameras, questions I couldn't hear over the blood pounding in my ears. Did you know, Mrs. Lawson? Was your husband living a double life? Were you part of the fraud? Someone snapped a photo of me standing on the porch, barefoot, hair unbrushed, holding a mug of untouched tea. That photo would run in newspapers across Georgia by nightfall, with headlines like, "The Banker's Betrayal. Wife Left in the Dark?" Southern Scandal Erupts in Savannah. The story spread like fire. Overnight, I went from being Richard Lawson's wife to the woman who didn't know. And no one knows what to do with a woman who didn't know. Church friends stopped calling. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Some looked at me with pity. Others with suspicion. I wasn't arrested, but I was convicted, by whispers, by headlines, by silence. The bank froze our accounts. The house was placed under investigation. The children were pulled into meetings and questions they didn't understand. Richard's lawyer stopped by once to check on things, really just to ask if there were any assets in my name he needed to be aware of. There weren't. All I had was the cottage on the coast, left to me by my grandmother before she passed. A place I'd nearly sold years ago, thinking we didn't need it. Now, it was the only roof I could still call mine, so I packed what I could, told the children we needed a little getaway, and walked away from the grand house on Magnolia Street. Not with my head held high, but with my eyes wide open. The cottage smelled like dust and salt. It had been years since anyone had lived there, maybe longer since anyone had cared for it. The windows were clouded, the porch sagged on one side, and ivy had begun curling around the chimney like it wanted to pull the place back into the earth. But it was mine. I hadn't stepped foot in it since before the children were born. It had belonged to my grandmother, passed down to me with a short letter and a rusted key. I almost sold it once, back when Richard said we didn't need it, that we'd outgrown little things. Funny how the little things are what end up saving you. Caroline and James didn't ask many questions. They were still too stunned from the arrest, the headlines, the sideways glances at school. Caroline, 16 and sharp-eyed, had already started packing before I asked. James, only 9, still called the cottage a vacation, like this was all just a long weekend. I let him believe it. The first night, we slept on old mattresses covered in quilts that smelled of cedar and thyme. No TV. No neighbors. Just the sound of waves crashing softly beyond the dunes and a wind that spoke through the cracks in the walls. It was the first time I'd heard silence that didn't feel dangerous. There was no plan. No grand vision. Just survival. We spent the first few days cleaning, airing out the rooms, scrubbing the floors, clearing cobwebs from the corners. The more I cleaned, the more my body remembered itself. Muscles I hadn't used in years woke up again. My hands stopped trembling. I kept thinking, this is mine. This is real. This isn't made of secrets. Money was tight. The bank accounts were frozen, and the media was still circling like vultures. I had enough cash for a few weeks, what I'd managed to hide, plus what I sold from the house before the estate investigators moved in. So I did what I knew how to do, I baked. My grandmother had taught me to bake on these same countertops. Peach pies, pecan tarts, pound cake. Food that made people feel loved even when they weren't. I started small, just a few pies, taken to the local seafood shack where the owner's wife remembered my grandmother's name. Word spread. Orders followed. Locals didn't care who I'd been married to. They just cared that the crust was buttery and the filling didn't come from a can. For the first time in months, I made something people wanted. Not because it had Richard's name on it. Because I made it. The children started settling too. Caroline found work helping a local painter stretch canvases. James spent hours on the beach collecting driftwood and shells. He brought me a perfectly white stone one day and said, "It looks like it got washed clean." I almost cried. I still didn't know what came next. The newspapers were still printing stories. Richard was awaiting trial. I hadn't heard from his lawyer again. No one from church had called. And yet, in the quiet of that little house, I didn't feel like a ghost anymore. I felt like a woman rebuilding herself from ash and flour. It was a Tuesday. Late afternoon. The kind of golden, hazy hour where time slows and the air feels soft enough to forgive you. I had just taken a tray of pecan pies out of the oven when I heard the knock. Not a firm one. Not the kind of knock that expects to be welcomed. Just 3 soft taps. Hesitant. Almost apologetic. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door. And there she was. Claire Bishop. Her hair was tangled, her eyes swollen from crying or lack of sleep, maybe both. She wore a wrinkled coat that looked 2 sizes too big and held a small bag in one hand. Her other hand rested gently on her stomach, which was unmistakably round. Pregnant. Far along. We stood there for a few seconds, long enough to feel all the words we weren't saying swirl in the space between us. "Margaret," she said finally, voice small. I didn't know where else to go. I said nothing. Because what do you say to the woman who helped your husband plan your erasure? She must have seen it in my eyes, the battle between instinct and grace, fury and fatigue. She didn't plead. She didn't explain. She just added, "He promised me everything." Then he vanished. Left me with nothing. Not even a place to sleep. Still, I didn't move. Then James appeared behind me, barefoot and holding a pine cone, looking at Claire like she was a stranger passing through a dream. She looked down, maybe ashamed. Maybe realizing she'd knocked on a door that still had splinters from the life she helped burn down. "Please," she whispered. "I don't need much. Just a night inside. Just to feel safe." I don't know what moved my hand to open the door wider. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was pride, refusing to be the woman Richard thought I was, the one who would turn bitter and cold. Or maybe, somewhere deep down, I saw her for what she really was, not a co-conspirator, but another woman who had been lied to. I let her in. She sat at the kitchen table, eyes flickering at the photos on the wall, the dishes in the sink, the quiet ordinariness of a life she'd never expected to find herself in. She didn't cry. She just sat there, hands around a cup of water, like she was waiting for me to change my mind and tell her to leave. "He told me he was filing for divorce," she said. "Said you were cruel. Controlling. Said you cheated. That your kids hated you. He even said you'd threatened to hurt yourself." I felt something tighten in my chest, not heartbreak, not shock, but disgust. Not at her, but at how thorough Richard had been. How he'd created a version of me for her to hate, just like he created a version of himself for the world to love. "You believed him," I said flatly. She nodded. "Until he disappeared. That night, I made up the guest room. She didn't ask for anything. Didn't expect warmth. She just curled up with her coat still on and fell asleep before the moon was fully up. I stood outside the door for a while. Not as her enemy, not as a saint. Just as a woman who knew what it felt like to be betrayed by the same man, in different ways. And in the silence of that old house, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to consider since the morning I found the safe. Maybe I wasn't alone in this story after all. We didn't talk much in the beginning. Claire stayed mostly in the guest room, emerging in the mornings with dark circles under her eyes and thank yous whispered like apologies. She offered to help clean, fold laundry, sweep, anything to feel useful, I think. Anything to earn her place. I didn't ask her to, but I didn't stop her either. There was an unspoken rhythm between us, cautious but steady. 2 women navigating the wreckage left behind by the same man, orbiting each other like survivors from different shipwrecks who washed up on the same shore. It wasn't forgiveness. It was function. The pies kept selling. The local seafood place doubled their orders. A nearby church asked if I catered small events. I said yes, even though I hadn't, not really. But desperation has a way of making you say yes to things you're not ready for. That night, I told Claire I could use help. She didn't blink. She rolled up her sleeves and stepped into the kitchen like she was walking into a confessional. She was a good cook. Not great, not yet, but careful. Focused. She followed my lead. Asked questions. Took notes. She didn't try to impress me. She just wanted to learn. And I respected that more than I thought I would. We started with casseroles. Macaroni and cheese with smoked paprika. Chicken pot pie with rosemary crust. Simple, southern, comforting. Meals that reminded people of better days. People placed orders. Paid in cash. Left notes that said things like tastes like my mother's table or first warm meal I've had since my husband passed. It felt like healing, one dish at a time. One afternoon, while shaping biscuit dough, Claire broke the silence. He used to talk about this, she said quietly. A bakery on the coast. Said we'd open one together. Call it Salt and Honey. Said you didn't understand his dreams. Said you only cared about appearances. I kept kneading dough. And now? I asked. She sighed. Now I know he was just building the same lie for both of us. Different packaging. Same rot inside. That was the first time I saw her as something more than just the other woman. She wasn't innocent. But she wasn't cruel either. She'd been used, just like me, in a longer con than either of us had words for. The business grew faster than we expected. Orders filled the kitchen counter. We wrote menus on the backs of envelopes. The cottage oven worked overtime. We saved every dollar we could. Claire suggested a name, Magnolia and Salt. I didn't love it. But I didn't hate it either. It felt honest. Southern and weathered. Like us. We printed just one flyer. Claire handed it out at the farmer's market, and I left a copy at the florist. At the post office, a woman asked if we did weddings. I glanced at Claire. She smiled faintly. We can, I said. That night, after the children were asleep, we sat on the porch with tea and aching feet. We didn't talk about Richard. Not directly. But everything unsaid floated between us like a second language. Grief. Survival. Rage. Relief. Strangers saw two women running a pie business from a forgotten cottage. We knew the truth, we weren't just baking, we were rebuilding, from flour and fire. It was the first quiet summer in years. Business grew steady. Claire was settling into motherhood. Caroline was finishing college. James had grown into a boy with sand-colored hair and sticky hands from peach juice. The house pulsed with life again, not loud, but warm. Then James came home from school carrying a folded newspaper. Mama, did you know Daddy wrote a book? My chest tightened. The Georgia Sentinel headline froze me. The Lawson confession, banker's prison memoir claims truth was buried with him. Richard had written a memoir, in prison. And it was being published. That night, after everyone slept, I sat on the porch and read every word. It was clever, slippery, written in that charming voice he'd used in church bulletins and fundraising letters. He admitted to mistakes, but not fraud. Not theft. And never betrayal. The part that sickened me was how he wrote about me. My wife, God bless her, was a complicated woman. She suffered quietly, resented deeply, and made our home colder than any cell I've known. Margaret had her own sins, coldness, infidelity, even violence. Lies. All of it, but woven so smoothly that strangers might believe every word. And someone did. 2 days later, James asked to talk. We sat in the kitchen, the room where he learned to walk, where he'd eaten peanut butter crackers in silence during the trial. Why didn't you tell me more back then? He asked. I wanted to say, because you were a child. Because I was protecting you. Because your father wanted me erased. Instead, I said, I was trying to survive, James. He hesitated. He says you burned documents. That you framed him. The words stung before they landed. You think I set your father up? He looked away. Enough of an answer. I think, maybe you weren't as innocent as you acted. That was the first time I'd heard Richard's voice in my son's. I stood, not angry, not defensive. Just tired. Your father stole from veterans and widows. He lied to everyone, including you. If I hadn't done what I did, you'd be visiting both of us in prison, not just him. He left without more words. I didn't cry then. Not when Claire found me later in the kitchen. Not when Caroline called after seeing the memoir, but that night, lying awake in the dark, I realized survival carried its own cost, telling the truth, only to watch your child doubt it. The past wasn't buried. It was being rewritten. And if I didn't take back the pen soon, my life would be published without me. I had one last secret. Not Richard's. Mine. In an old jewelry box at the back of my closet lay a small brass key. It unlocked the hidden panel beneath my grandmother's dresser. Inside was a bundle of documents I had never given the authorities, papers I'd found weeks after the raid. I had avoided them for years, but after James's doubt, I knew I had to look. At the top was a handwritten confession. Richard had listed offshore transfers, fake deeds, false accounts. And at the bottom, in messy scrawl, Orphan Fund / Trinity Trust, 112K moved, came en route, never traceable. The Orphan Fund. The one our church ran for widows, parents, and children. People gave in memory of their dead. He hadn't just stolen from strangers. He had stolen from God. And I held the proof in my hands. I could have taken it to prosecutors. To the press. I could have silenced every whisper, proved to my children that I had only ever defended myself. But I didn't. I carried the papers into the backyard. With a matchbook and a tin bucket, I fed them one by one into the fire. Not to protect Richard. To protect myself, from becoming a woman who clung to poison just to prove she'd been bitten. Some truths don't need justice. They need release. By the time the flames died, there was only ash. And peace. Decades have passed since the trial. Since the safe. Since the woman I used to be locked herself in a room and wondered how to escape a life built on lies. The cottage remains small, but it holds more joy than the mansion ever did. The catering business, Magnolia and Salt, thrives. Locals still ask for my pecan pies. Claire runs most of it now. She's family, though we never said it aloud. Caroline teaches literature at the college. James visits every other weekend. We don't talk about his father anymore. Some silences don't need breaking. This morning, I sat on the porch with my grandchildren. The youngest asked why I never remarried. I smiled, because once I found myself again, I didn't want to lose her. There was no applause. No parade. Just peace. Earned, not gifted. People still remember Richard Lawson. Some still believe his version. That used to trouble me. Now? I know the truth. I lived it. I survived it. And when someone tries to erase you, that's when you pick up the pen and write your own story.